Okay. Hello, debaters of Europe and I guess the world. I'm just going to do a quick sound check before I start the workshop. Just checking that the sound and picture quality is okay. Okay, and apparently it is. If at any point you can't hear me, or I'm not speaking clearly enough, or if the audio or picture quality drops, just let me know in the chat. Other than that, we are good to go. I think the connection's not brilliant, so the picture isn't going to be fantastic, but the audio should be okay. And I guess that's the important part. But yeah, okay, so hello. My name is Owen Mooney. I'm the current European Debating Championship, assuming you're watching this before 2018 Euros. I'm going to be doing a workshop for you today on comparative argumentation. Basically, just before I start, if you have any questions, you can obviously ask them in the live chat at the side, and I'll answer them towards the end of the workshop. If you're watching the recording, as I imagine most people watching this are, then you can get in touch with me. Probably on Facebook is the best way to get hold of me. Just search Owen Mooney on Facebook, and you should be able to find me. Feel free to add me on Facebook or just drop me a message if you've got any questions for any further clarifications about either this workshop or just, I guess, anything debating related at all. I'm not the fastest at getting back to people via Messenger, but I will eventually get it, and that's probably the best way if you have any questions and you're watching this at some point in future. Okay, so to get right into it, comparative argumentation. So this is a concept that if any of you have debated for any length of time, you'll certainly be aware of or have some familiarity. And if you're sort of new to debating, this is one of the hardest things to, it's like one of the, not the hardest thing, but I think one of the main things to try and get your head around as to what separates out competitive debating from normal sort of political discourse or argumentation. I'm going to talk about this workshop in broadly three areas. I'm going to talk about identifying comparatives. I'm going to talk about challenging comparatives. And I'm going to talk about how it is that we actually use them to your advantage to help win debates. So to sort of basically explain what a comparative is, I find the easiest way to get this across is that in a debate, nothing is good or bad. Everything is either better or worse than an alternative. It's never just good enough to say there are some bad aspects or some good aspects that might be related to a policy or to an idea. You always have to show why they're better or worse. To give you, like, you can even take some quite extreme examples with this. So I think, for example, the question of like whether or not, there's literally no way to answer the question whether something is good or is bad without comparing it to something else. Either you're sort of comparing it, if you're a sort of moral relativist, then you're comparing it to some other moral state. Or even if you sort of claim access to some type of absolute moral code, then you're necessarily comparing anything to that moral code. So to give you, I realize it's all weirdly abstract, but to give you an example, if we were to ask the question of whether, I don't know, the USA is a good state, that really depends a lot on what you're comparing it to. I mean, if you're comparing it to literally no state at all, where we all just club each other and eat each other's brains and bash each other's heads open with rocks, eat each other's brains, then obviously, yes, it is very good compared to that. However, if you compare it to some sort of idealized utopia, which is perfect in every way, then it's obviously worse than that because it's not perfect. So the question as to whether or not it is good is you're comparing it to some sort of other thing. Or even if you think there is an objective standard of what marks out a good state, you'd then just be comparing at every stage whether or not the USA meets that criteria. This is all very, very abstract, of course. Most debating topics are much less abstract and clearer. Hopefully this will be a bit clearer based on the examples that I use as I go through this. But it's just to sort of give you an idea. So regarding comparatives, there's two aspects to every comparative. There's sort of two things you have to be aware of. One is what is changing, and two is what is staying the same. When you implement a policy, either in the sort of form of this house would, so where the state's doing a thing, or if in a this house supports, where we're judging whether or not we should support something that is happening, or something that exists, or something that is being done. Anything that changes as a result of that thing, for good or for bad, can be used as argumentation by either side to try and win the debate. So if there are a whole host of good things that happen when we, for example, release all non-violent offenders, then you could claim that from prop. If you were in a motion, this house would pardon all non-violent offenders. Similarly, if there's some very bad things that happens, you might claim this from op. Anything that doesn't change can't be claimed by either side as sort of positive argumentation or positive material for them. For example, again, actually to use the same example, in the motion, this house would release all non-violent offenders, pointing out that it would be very bad if violent offenders were to be released, would be wholly irrelevant for either side, because it's something that's not changing as a result of this. Or maybe just pointing out how bad it is that prisons have to exist at all. Again, would be not relevant material for either side of the debate in that question. This isn't to say that you could never refer to things that don't change. I'll talk about this a bit later on, but sometimes it can be an effective technique of rebuttal or mitigation to point out lots of things that aren't going to change, to try and sort of minimize the impact of a good thing that will change. So if, for example, we were setting the motion, this house would ban school uniforms, and you maybe say something about how, or this house supports school uniforms, let's say. And one of the prop arguments is that school uniforms are good because it means you can't tell the children's sort of how wealthy children are based on the quality of their clothes. So we would reduce bullying based upon socioeconomic status or income, and this might be good for educational attainment for people from poorer backgrounds. It might be effective rebuttal or mitigation from op to sort of mitigate this by saying, oh, okay, well, yes, this might make it a little bit better, but here's like 30 other reasons as to why poorer children do less well in school, which aren't changing. You're only changing one very small bit of the equation, and use that to sort of minimize that argument and try and run other material. But I'll talk about this a bit more later on. But yes, so broadly, like, this will seem incredibly obvious to lots of you watching this, but for some newer people, it's just bearing in mind with comparatives, we're talking about anything that is changing as a result. We're talking about anything that changes when we're comparing two different things. Okay, so the first section I'm going to talk about here is how to identify comparatives. Now, there's a few sort of different types or archetypes that debates will break down into here, which I'm just sort of going to go through in order. So the first type is when the comparative is very clear, when it's just the status quo. So to give an example of this, if we say this house would hold a second Brexit referendum, it's very clear what the comparative is, right? We're saying currently the world is, however it looks now, we're going to hold another referendum on Brexit. What we're comparing is the world as it exists now versus a world where there is a second referendum on Brexit held. This is, I'm not sure it's the most common. It certainly is a common enough type. And it's by far the simplest, because because this is when there is the least difference between debating comparatively and debating non-comparatively. So basically any reason you can think of as to why a second referendum would be good or bad is probably going to be comparative with the status quo. So it's very straightforward in that sense. The second type of, or the second sort of archetype for comparatives is where the comparative is likely to be either a partial fulfillment of the motion or some sort of change to the status quo that would be small and extremely sensible. So to give an example here, in the motion, this House would legalise all drugs. It is now this House would legalise all drugs. It is not necessarily clear that OP has to stand behind exactly the status quo drug policy with all of its sort of irrationalities and arbitrary cruelties built into that. Very likely, it would be fair, or an OP would say, okay, we're happy to legalise drugs that are considered harmless. So we might legalize cannabis or whatever. And similarly, for them to say, we would of course also change drug laws so that they don't exist in the sort of current unfair way. So, for example, we wouldn't maintain the distinction in sentencing between crack and powdered cocaine. This is so. What that would essentially change for your argumentation, it changes very little about the sort of best arguments, but it would then mean that if you're on prop and this House would legalise all drugs, it is unlikely to be, it is probably going to be non-comparative if you prepare a whole case about why some drugs are just totally harmless and shouldn't be banned and there's no problem with them at all. There's no health risks and no one could ever be harmed by using them, because it's very likely that a sensible op is just going to stand up and say, we'll legalise the completely or relatively harmless drugs, in which case the debate we're having is basically, should hard drugs be legalized? So that would be the second type. The third type, sort of archetype of comparison, is where it is specified in the motion what the comparative is. This is by far the clearest and easiest, but there are a couple of traps that it is possible to fall into here. So to give an example, this might look like the motion that says, this House prefers this House prefers a world with stronger collective bargaining power for workers, as opposed to one with stronger legislation on labour law. Or another sort of classic in this vein is, this House believes that states should prioritise reducing inequality over growing the economy as fast as possible. These are very obvious comparatives because the motion literally tells you what it is in each case. So, for example, prop is defending strong trade unions and weaker laws, whereas op is defending weak unions and strong laws. Or in the second debate, prop is defending a world in which there is very low inequality, but where economic growth is slow, and op is defending a world in which there is faster economic growth, but also higher inequality. So you don't really have to think very much about what the comparative is here. There's a couple of traps or things you can try and fall into here. It's very common in debating, in lots of debates, that as well as claiming all the benefits that would probably accrue on your side of the house, you'll try and also contest your opponent's benefits. So very often it's strategically wise to try and argue that you will get their benefits better on your side of the house. Now, you can still do this to some extent in motions like this where it specifies a comparative. Sometimes the wording of the motion will literally not let you. Sometimes the wording will specify that where there is a trade-off or where there is difference. But when the motion doesn't do that, you can feel free to try and sort of claim the other side's benefits. This can be a kind of a problem in this sort of debate because you can kind of actually end up proving that there is no debate. So, for example, a very common very common example of this, which I've seen a few times, is in the debate of this House would prioritise reducing inequality over growing the economy as fast as possible. Teams on prop try to be very clever and say, aha, but lower inequality in fact leads to faster economic growth because of XYZ reasons relating to aggregate demand and marginal propensity to consume and all the rest of it. The problem with this is then there is literally no debate, because if a government can do both things at once, then it's not obvious, it's literally not obvious what the debate is. Increasingly, I think there's a trend. Increasingly, I think motion setters are aware of this, and motion setters probably should be aware of this when they're testing their balance. And a judge will usually notice it as well. But it is probably worth pointing out or thinking of that if you ever are in one of these debates where it's asking you to choose one thing over another thing, thing A over thing B, and some team opposite you says, aha, we can get thing A and thing B, it's probably worth pointing out that in that case, you could also get thing A and thing B, and there's just no debate. The debate is only about where we are trading off between thing A and thing B, because if we can get them both at once, then there isn't then that's just not a debate, or that is something that both sides can fairly do. The fourth type rather, of sort of comparative is where one team decides to explicitly counterprop. I should probably talk about counterprops in general a bit here. I think the general advice with counterpropping is don't. It is very rarely in your best strategic interest to counterprop. There are lots of situations where it is reasonable to suggest alternatives. Most commonly where there's a debate where the debate falls along the lines of this house would try to fix a problem that is definitely bad. So in a motion like this house would intervene in Myanmar to stop ethnic cleansing of Rohingyas. It's never going to be possible from op to argue that ethnic cleansing isn't a problem, or that it's fine, or that the situation now is basically okay. You'll certainly want to suggest some sort of alternatives. Now, you might, to be fair, just say, we think the current situation is very bad, but what the prop requires would just make everything worse. That is, of course, possible to do. But it will often be helpful for you to suggest some alternatives. So for example, we wouldn't support an armed intervention, but we would support the use of sanctions or diplomatic efforts to try and secure a solution to the crisis. If you do want to counterprop those, so that is from opening opposition, just offer an explicit alternative. In general, the reason this is less advantageous than just suggesting some alternatives is because you're then committed to the counterprop. So the debate becomes not just about whether or not the original motion is a good or a bad idea, but also about whether or not your counterprop is a good or a bad idea. It is this sort of leaves you doubly vulnerable, because there's now two ways you can lose a debate, either because you've failed to adequately show problems with the motion, or because your suggestion has your counterprop has a whole host of other miscellaneous problems with it. It also tends to make debates quite confusing and difficult to judge, because it's like then there's almost like two different debates happening at once. So there's the original debate, and you're weighing up arguments in favor and arguments against that, and then there's a counterprop where you're weighing arguments in favor and arguments against. And again, it is not likely to be in your interest to make the debate confusing and difficult to judge. If you are going to counterprop, like very occasionally, there might be some circumstances where you do need to do it. Just remember the sort of basic thing, the sort of most basic rule about it is your counterprop has to, first of all, be mutually exclusive. The most common problem you see with this is like people propose alternatives that aren't really alternatives. So in this house would legalize all drugs. They say, nah, our alternative is we're going to massively invest in job and training programs, so there's less unemployed people who might sort of feel the need to turn to drugs. That's non-comparative in the sense that it's not related to the motion, and it's something both teams could do, or both sides of the debate could equally well do. So remember to make your counterprops mutually exclusive. Prove that it is a case of doing the prop or doing your counterprop. And secondly is to remember that this is a kind of like rule or approximation in VP debating rather than one that is logically demanded, but it's nonetheless used, which is your counterprop or alternative should only consume equal resources to that of the prop. This is basically to make it, try and make the debate fair. So again, for example, if in this house would legalize all drugs, you stood up in O and said, nah, instead what we're going to do is we're going to get a personalized drone for every single person who has ever grown or sold a drug. And we're going to, at the same time, like genetically engineer viruses that will kill all the crops that grow cocaine and all the poppies that grow heroin. Therefore, we'll solve the drug problem by just abolishing all drugs. This, like, it is mutually exclusive. But it is also demands like a vastly more resources than the prop could possibly demand. So in that sense, it's not really fair. It's not like a fair or balanced debate if one side gets access to far more resources. But that would be counterpropping. The fifth type then of comparative or sort of archetype of debate where you'll be asked, or sort of archetype of what the comparative can be, is like radically different historical or counterfactuals, or motions which ask you to like radically reimagine human society. These motions would normally follow along the lines of this house prefers a world with X thing being different. So for example, this house prefers a world without organized religion, or this house would prefer a world with no strong emotions. These are a class of motion I would say are literally undebatable, because it is impossible to ever ascertain or really make any sort of fair claims, or any sort of like judgeable or adjudicatable claims as to what the comparatives would be. So for example, in a world with no organized religion, that is, you never had Christianity, you never had Islam, the whole world would look so radically different that it's impossible to imagine. Like, this is like no crusades, no Islamic conquests, like plausibly no nation states are like no nation states along the European model. Like it's just everything. It is impossible to tell how the entirety of human history would have been different had this thing occurred. So it's very difficult to tell what arguments are comparatively different. Or similarly, like in a motion with this house would prefer a world without strong emotion. Given, like, again, it is sort of impossible to tell how an absence of strong emotion would have changed any given historical event. I mean, maybe if Gavrilo Princip hadn't felt so strong in his nationalism, or so strongly motivated by nationalism, he would never have assassinated Franz Ferdinand, and the First World War would never have started, and the whole of the past 100 years would be different. Or again, like further back, I don't know, maybe I forget which Spanish king, but the one who sent the Spanish Armada never got so annoyed at England that he felt he had to conquer it, so sent an armada. So all of European history is different. Like it's very difficult to make any definite claims about these. However, sometimes there's still a bit of a trend for setting some of these motions. So you might have to encounter or be asked to debate some of these. If you are doing it, like facetiously, I would say, facetiously, I think style or sounding nice or sounding plausible matters a lot more in these debates, because like if the judge can't actually logically adjudicate which comparative is the more realistic, then they'll probably just default to however posh your accent is or whatever. But there are a few things you can sort of try and do to establish your positions in these. So I think the best way is probably to try and make your comparative, or make what you're defending, as narrow and limited as possible. So even though it is probably true that a world with no strong emotions would look unimaginably different to what the world looks like nowadays, it is probably going to be easier if you pick one aspect of humanity or the world that could plausibly, and imagine how that would be changed with this. So for example, you might talk about how the conduct of war would markedly improve if people weren't driven by sort of fear or rage to commit war crimes or kill civilians or whatever else. Or you might want to talk about how political discourse could get better. Or you might want to talk about how families and family structures might be worse or weaker if parents weren't motivated by a huge amount of love to make lots of sacrifices for their children. Some sort of like pick a narrower aspect and or one aspect that you can sort of hone in on and defend when you're talking about these motions. Okay, the final type is the most general type. And this is, I don't know if this is the most common, but it is the type of motion where the comparative is not clear or is up for debate, so is analytically contestable. So what I mean by that is this will usually take the form of a motion which doesn't specify that there is, doesn't specify what the alternative is, or where the alternative, and where the status quo in this is not clear or might be analytically contestable. And I'll give you here a few tips for how you should select, or how you should pick a comparative for this. So the example we're going to take is from round 9 of the most recent Euros. This house supports the creation of lethal autonomous robots for use in war. So basically we'll create some Terminators and we'll send them out to fight wars. So this is a motion where it's a very interesting motion. There's lots of good arguments and stuff to talk about. but in terms of identifying what a comparative is, so what precisely is the alternative to doing this? It might be the status quo. You might just sort of talk about why conventional armies are better than robots. That's fine, or worse than robots. That's fine. And you can have a perfectly good debate just doing that. But it is also useful to think about any world with or without this, what changes? So a few questions to sort of ask yourself is: one, why do actors do certain things? Why do actors do certain things? So why might a military create lethal autonomous robots? Presumably it's because it wants the most effective way to kill lots of enemies without costing its own soldiers' lives, either because it cares about soldiers and wants to maintain its fighting capacity, or because it's concerned of a body bag effect, whereby if there's too many of its own soldiers die, then you'll lose political support for whatever war it is that you're fighting. In which case, think, okay, how is it that currently military commanders try and get around this? Well, currently the way they do it isn't through. So if they had access to lethal autonomous robots, they'd probably use those. But in a world in which they don't have these, or where it's not available, what do they do instead? Well, they do things like use drones, like robots controlled by people. And very often you might want to make arguments. If you're on prop, for example, you might want to say that this alternative or this comparative is worse than lethal autonomous robots, because then we have all the awesome destructive powers that you would have with a killer robot. Just you have a human guiding it who can get lazy, who can be tired, who can be on drugs, who can be sort of racist or prejudiced against the people you're fighting, and that's worse because they'll kill more people or make more mistakes or whatever. So thinking about why do certain things happen? Why do actors behave in certain ways? Second question that you can sort of think to yourself is, what does this allow actors to stop doing? So to kind of in a similar vein, but to give you a slightly different example, the ESL final of Euros 2014 was something like, assuming it was feasible or whatever, this house would engineer soldiers to not feel fear, or this house would allow soldiers to not feel fear. In which case, I think I forget the teams involved, but a sort of particularly clever prop argument was to point out that currently the way that we make soldiers not feel fear is either through training that dehumanizes them incredibly thoroughly, or through things like, as some armies do, like literally just give them drugs, like give them amphetamines or cocaine or alcohol, sort of make them more ferocious and less afraid. And this can potentially help you to establish a favorable comparative, saying, well, our way of a magic pill would be better than these alternatives for whatever reason. And the sort of third big question to ask yourself is, what is likely to happen in response to whatever is changing? So again, to come back to the lethal autonomous robots example, you might be concerned about, if you're sitting in OG, how what the rules of war are and how they make currently no sort of, there's no rules of war for what lethal autonomous robots should or shouldn't be allowed to do. Like, is it who gets blamed for a war crime if they kill a bunch of civilians? Like, do we just smash up the robot? Like, do we jail the programmer? Like, is it the military commander? Like, whatever. And you might be worried that an op could make arguments saying that the sort of blurred lines of accountability makes war crimes and stuff more likely. It is plausible to think, though, that in a comparative world where there are lethal autonomous robots, that other actors would adapt to this change. So we might, for example, adapt or change the rules of war, or come up with some sort of solution to lots of these logistical problems. So those are just like a few questions, and that might then change what this comparative world looks like. So those are just like an examples of a few questions to ask yourself when you're trying to think about what is the comparative actually. If it's not the status quo, then what is it? Think about, like, why do actors behave how they do? What does this allow actors to do or stop doing? What processes currently lead to people behaving in this way, and how are people likely to react to this change? When you're picking a comparative, the thing to do is, like, don't go crazy. So you don't want to, like, even OG, right? You stand up and you say, we support the creation of lethal autonomous drones because we think the comparative is we'll move towards a world where every man, woman, and child is conscripted into the army, and that'd be terrible. This would be unlikely to be persuaded. Like, this would obviously be in your interest if you could prove that were the comparative. but it's unlikely to be particularly persuasive to a judge or to anyone else in the room that it's likely to be. So you want to be with comparatives, thinking about what is in your strategic interest. So you want to think about like, what is the most favorable possible comparative for our site, but also not like take the piss or go mad with this. You want to pick one that is favorable, but also sounds fair. It's because that just means your opponents are less likely to challenge it, but also the judge is more likely to accept it or give it credit if it sounds like something that could be fairly debated, as opposed to if it sounds undebatable. Okay, so the second broad issue I'm going to talk about, the second broad area, is how to challenge comparatives. So is how to challenge your opponent's comparative. So if, for example, you've gone into a debate and prep with one idea of what you think the comparative is going to be, and your opponents have come in with a completely different one, how do you challenge this and prove to the judge that your comparative is the better? Okay, so my first point on this is don't. Similarly to, if at all possible, avoid trying to challenge the comparative your opponents talk about. Just debate them on their own comparative. Like, accept their comparative and explain why it is still better or worse, why it is still better for your side, or why it is still worse than whatever the policy in question is. The reason for this is kind of similar to counterpropping. If you're just debating each other's comparatives, you're not actually really having the debate. It can lead to sort of very messy and difficult to adjudicate debates, because like, if all of your arguments are contingent upon policy X being worse than comparative A, and if your opponents are claiming that no, we're not going to get comparative A, we're going to get comparative B, and all of their arguments are contingent upon why policy X is better than comparative B, then none of your arguments are actually clashing with each other, and almost everything would fold into the question of which of the two comparatives is more plausible. And given that it's often very difficult for judges to determine which it is, given that it could be either one, it can lead to sort of very messy and difficult to judge debates. And judges will in general prefer it, and it is also just like by the rules of debating, you are taking your opponent at a higher burden if you're engaging with them on their comparative, on their best case. Then you should be trying to do that. So even if you are going to contest a comparative, then you should also try and engage on their comparative as well. Say, okay, so we've contested their comparative in my first point, but here in rebuttal, let's just assume that it is as they say it is going to be. Here's why we still beat them, because X, Y, Z reasons or whatever. I'm actually going to turn on the light just now. Sorry, just 1 second. Yeah, there we go. I think that's helped the quality of the picture a little bit, although it can't make up for my potato of a webcam. Okay, so where were we? Yes, contesting comparatives. So two further things to say here. Firstly, the most common or effective way, and also like the most legitimate circumstances to contest a comparative, is when your opponents have misused their fiat power. So what I mean by that is, governments obviously have a certain amount of fiat to not just propose a motion, but say we might also do some other things to make sure this policy works or is effective. And very commonly, it's not uncommon for governments to sometimes abuse or use too much of this fiat power. So I don't know if, for example, in the debate, this House believes that the Palestinian people should abandon all claims to independent statehood and advocate instead for the creation of a single democratic Israeli-Palestinian state. If Prop were, for example, say, yep, so we're going to do this, but at the same time, we're also going to but at the same time, we recognize that Hamas might screw up this process, so we're going to completely wipe them out and just get rid of them. We'll use our fiat power to say no more Hamas. This is obviously setting up an extremely favorable comparative, but you might want to contest this from off by pointing out that government fiat probably doesn't extend that far to just magic away an endemic problem or an endemic group that's been there for however many years, even though it might be in their interest to do so. So this would be the most, or to the extent that government is able to say, we'll click our fingers and no more Hamas, you could also say that on off. So you could, for example, maintain the claim to independent statehood whilst also getting rid of Hamas. And so that would obviously be significantly better than the status quo. It would be significantly better than the status quo, and it means that some of the arguments they're trying to claim about less violence or whatever, they might not be able to, or wouldn't be comparative in that sense. So this would be the most common way for you to challenge it. Thirdly, though, if you are sort of having to challenge what the comparative is, you kind of just do this as you do contest any other argument or any other characterization, using whatever techniques you have for that. The best way to sort of think to yourself about it or express it is think, is this really what is likely to happen in this alternative world? So, Prop might want to be claiming that their world with soldiers engineered to not feel fear is a world in which soldiers don't commit war crimes or don't take drugs or don't use steroids or all the rest of it. But you might want to challenge it and say, well, is that really what is likely? Are there not other factors that could cause them to engage in that behavior or whatever? And then you just contest it as you would contest any other sort of argument or characterization. Okay, the third broad section of this workshop then, and the final one, is the question of how do we actually, how to sort of use comparatives. And this is basically just sort of some like, this is like, some of this should be very clear or very obvious, and a lot of this will flow from stuff being said earlier, but there are sort of few tips here that might be useful. So we can kind of break, I think, comparatives down to sort of two broad types. One is where you're comparing statics, and the other would be when you're comparing situations that are changing. To give an example of what the difference between these two things are, in the motion, this House would legalize all drugs. If we were to set it now, you'd make lots of arguments about how this might change, about how this, like if you were on prop, you might want to make some arguments about how it would be safer or whatever, and off, you might want to say more people get addicted, whatever. This is pretty much the same arguments you would use if this debate were set 20 years in the past, or if I were to come back to debating in 20 years, I'm sure people were still setting this motion, I'm sure the arguments would be pretty much the same. Because we're comparing sort of two static situations in the world. Like obviously in real life, like this would change, that's not to say it doesn't change things, but it's like, but we are comparing, like, for example, before this motion, we have like X number of drug deaths. After this motion, we have Y number of drug deaths. We're just comparing the difference between X and Y, and it's all sort of very simple and straightforward, comparing sort of two fixed things. To contrast this with when we're sort of comparing flows or flowing or changing situations. In the motion, this House supports Western intervention to, this House supports Western military intervention to support the Arab Spring. Probably would have been set a couple of years ago, but whatever. In that motion, very clearly what you're debating is two changing situations. So it's not the question of what does the world look like now versus what will it look like in a year after we've done this. Because both these situations are changing. So what we'd be comparing then is what is the status quo and how is the status quo changing going forward versus the change that we make, how will this change or lead to stuff being different going forward and sort of on into the long term. I've realized that's not especially clear, or I've not put that in the perhaps in the clearest possible language. I'm trying to think of like different ways of expressing it. I guess like the difference basically is this maybe isn't a clear-cut difference, but in a motion like this House would legalize all drugs, it's not that likely that teams would be thinking like, how would this policy affect us 10 or 20 years down the line? Like, it's just like, other than that being 10 or 20 year whatever impacts we're currently talking about, it's probably not that relevant to the clash to be talking about. Whereas with some motions, especially IR motions or regarding intervention, it is extremely relevant. What will this world look like in 5 or 10 years time? Because the greater impacts are probably to be found in that longer term. But anyway, to deal with sort of first set, like a lot of this stuff is just the very straightforward stuff we've already talked about. So think, okay, what is the aspect that is changing? as a result of legalizing all drugs. So drugs are getting safer, but maybe more people are also using said drugs because there's less likely to go to jail. Who knows? What isn't changing? Probably there's some inherent danger and addictiveness, which even with like better regulation or better safety testing or people being more knowledgeable about what drugs they're taking, there's no getting around the fact that heroin is just a dangerous and addictive thing to inject into yourself. So then think, how does one of these interact with the other? So, for example, there are more people taking a safer version of the drug. Does that lead to more or fewer drug-related deaths? And you could win this claim from either side. It would depend a lot on how persuasive. It basically depends on how large each number is. So, if the drugs are getting 1,000,000 times safer and only 3 more people are taking them, then probably there's a lot fewer drug-related deaths. Whereas if the drugs are only getting, say, 10% safer, but like the number of people who take them quadruples, then we're getting much more drug-related deaths. And the way, obviously, in BP, you're not adjudicating on numbers, on statistics. That would depend on just like the relative quality of each team's analysis towards trying to prove how much safer it's getting versus how many more people are taking them. So that's all very straightforward stuff. In a sort of flowing situation, however, or a changing situation, the question isn't just you're doing that as well, of course, thinking what is changing, what is staying the same, how do the two interact? But it's then thinking, how do all actors, or how does society, or how does the sort of context or situation change in response to this interaction, especially going forward? So in a motion, for example, if we were saying this House believes that Western states should have militarily intervened in support of the Arab Spring, then you might be saying, okay, so the immediate impact of this is that we intervened and we had a war in Syria, and it meant there was no ISIS because there were just Western soldiers. There were Western soldiers everywhere, but it also meant there were Western soldiers everywhere. That's something that's changing. Something that isn't changing is probably lots and lots of people being dead, because whether from a civil war or a foreign war, that was likely to happen. How does this interact? Maybe how does this interact? Like, again, would sort of depend on which side is better able to persuasively argue for whichever side has the best arguments for whether it is the Syrian civil war or a hypothetical intervention that would kill more people. But it's also then useful to think about how would this have changed, or how would this affect the international stage then going forward. So would this, for example, have made, this would probably then have meant going forward that Russia would not have been able to intervene in the Syrian civil war or prop its power prop up its power in Syria. Maybe then the comparative is Russia would have done something else to try and sort of project power abroad. Maybe it would have been more aggressive in pursuing territorial claims in Eastern Europe, or whatever. Or maybe the opposite. Maybe Russia, when it was unable to project its power abroad or use the Syrian civil war as a distraction from domestic economic concerns, would have to sort of not be less expansionist and try and focus on its own economy to try and prop up Putin's power. Either of these, like, I'm not sort of making any claims as to the quality of or plausibility of these arguments. It's just an example of how it is that sometimes you do have to think not just what is the comparative now, but what is the comparative going forward, and how does the change we implement now influence what these potential comparatives are, in the future. So, sort of to kind of sum it all up, then, I think it's like, even if you are totally new to debating or you haven't done very much of this, you definitely have been using comparatives without knowing it, because just comparing doing something to the status quo is comparative. But as you'll sort of go on and go forward, there's a whole bunch of other more complex situations and more complex comparatives, and like, especially sort of at higher levels, correctly identifying or being sort of clever in your identification of a comparative can be a very good way to can be a very good way to win debates. So for example, I think the kind of classic or best example of this, if you're looking for a good illustration of this, is the Zagreb 2014 Euros final. Is a motion that this House believes that the feminist movement should oppose interventions with the stated aim of helping women. And OG and OO and CG have a perfectly good and actually very high quality debate of whether or not interventions can or can't be good for women, and if they can be good for women, then we should sometimes support them. If they can never be good for women, then the feminist movement should never support them. But CO actually wins by pointing out this is a false comparative, because it is unlikely that the sort of intervention of the feminist movement would ever change whether or not a war happens. So the comparative isn't the war happening or not. The comparative is just how does the feminist movement look, and their argument was then it would lose political capital, etc., etc., etc. And they won it on that basis. So I think that's sort of a classic or the best example. A classic or the best example. This is maybe like took my own horn slightly, but the most recent Euros final, 2017, I think is also a potential example where there is a very good and perfectly high quality debate about this. So the motion is this house believes we should treat the Russian Revolution as a tragedy rather than a triumph, or vice versa. No, yeah, as a tragedy rather than a triumph, I think. Yes, I just forget which way around it was. And there's a very good and extremely high quality debate as to whether or not, it was this house is the Kremlin, and it's whether or not this would be good or bad for Putin's security situation, which we were able to win from CG by pointing out like it's probably non-comparative given how little this would change Putin's security situation. So because he has like 1,000,001 other factors that are propping up his power. So we're probably looking for some other things that this might affect. Although I think the Zagreb 2014 final is definitely the one to watch if you're looking for an example of this. But yes, I hope this has been helpful. As I said right at the start, if you have any further questions, you can feel free to contact me on Facebook. Just search Owen Mooney, or I guess you can just like message it's now the Novi Sad EUDC 2018 page, or I guess just this YouTube account. If you've got a YouTube account, you could send a message to this one. If you've got any further questions about this, I'm sure they'd pass it on. But yes, thank you all very much for listening, and I hope that was helpful.